BBC Radio Berkshire. It is 10 to 12 now. Last week we learned about the Membury pilot Charlie Walker, who's teamed up with Newbury historian Roger Day to restore an original D-Day plane to fly on D-Day's 75th anniversary this coming June. Well, when we spoke to Roger, he told us why Membury and this particular plane played such an important part in the history of the Second World War.
Membury played a very important part in the history of World War II, particularly the D-Day operation, and it was constructed at the same time as four other local airfields. That's Ramsbury, Welford, Greenham Common, and Aldermaston, and initially they were built to act as training airfields for the RAF. So they became surplus to requirement just about the right time when the Americans joined the war, and therefore they were earmarked for use by American forces.
And just focusing on this particular type of plane that we're talking about on the show this morning, the night fright, and the fact that it was one of many Dakotas. Now, these were American planes flown by American troops?
Yes, they were. They were the workhorse, really, the Allies' workhorse. The British used them as well. We called them the Dakota. The Americans knew them as the C-47. And there were approximately, I suppose, 80 or 90 of these aircraft at Membury, similar numbers at the other airfields that I mentioned. And they were not just used for dropping paratroopers, they were also used for pulling gliders, also with troops and equipment on board across to Normandy.
Newbury historian Roger Day on Membury and its significance as far as D-Day was concerned anyway. Well, when we last spoke to Charlie, he was coming to us live from the Canadian wilderness where he'd secured another World War II plane, which he was planning to salvage for parts. He's now back in the UK. Let's catch up with him and see how he got on. So, Charlie, just recap then a little bit about Night Fright. We heard this story last week on the show, but tell us a little bit about how it came to be in your hands, this incredible Dakota.
Good morning, Sarah. So the story goes back to 2012, where we purchased C-47 Night Fright, a genuine sort of World War II warbird that flew from Membury and flew all of the major airborne operations throughout the Second World War, all of the D-Day missions, Market Garden, Varsity, the Rhine Crossing, sort of pretty much everything you can think of, really. So our dream was to reunite Night Fright with Membury Airfield and restore her and get her flying again. To be the only sort of C-47 flying from the original airfield where she saw wartime combat.
And bearing in mind, of course, these were American planes originally, this took you to the other side of the Atlantic. You found this Dakota, brought it back to the UK, and now you're busy trying to restore it. The last sort of segment of the journey, if you like, involved you going over to Canada to try and find some parts that then you could help to restore Night Fright with. Were you successful?
Yeah, it was a successful trip. I mean that's right. I mean we've certainly covered some ground as part of this project. Going back a little bit, we found the aircraft in a scrapyard in Arkansas in the United States where we rescued her from, and we've brought her back to Coventry in the UK to complete the restoration process, you say, Sarah. And yeah, last week we were in Canada. I led a team of 4 guys out to a place called Peterborough, about 200 kilometres northeast of Toronto, where we purchased another C-47 that we needed to utilise the parts from. So it was an adventure, that's for sure. It was minus 30 on arrival in Canada, so we spent the week working outside in minus 30, but we certainly got the parts we needed. It was a sort of a real treasure trove, really, and we found some unique items, which is certainly going to boost our project.
So what have you brought back with you then? It's a bit like going to a car boot sale, but on a much bigger scale, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. It is a bit like a car boot sale, to be honest, a giant car boot sale. But some of the items that we were after are what I'd call sort of unique historic items, really, stuff that's really, really hard to find, because if you think about it, all of these aeroplanes saw commercial service post-war, so they were all turned into airliners, or they were hauling freight or cargo or whatever, really. So they kind of lost their wartime originality. So a couple of things that we went for are what we call sort of paratrooper benches. So there were sort of a row of paratrooper benches down each side of the aeroplane inside, where all the troopers would have sat with all their gear. Now, these things are incredibly rare and very, very hard to make. So we managed to find a complete set of those benches in this aeroplane. And another thing that's incredibly rare is an original cargo floor that would have been in these aeroplanes that the guys obviously would have walked up and down on. So those items are worth a tremendous amount of sort of not just money, but also time to us. And, we also grabbed a few bits from the aeroplane to to replace bits, on our existing aircraft that are going to save sort of time and money, really. So it was a very, very successful trip.
I find it remarkable that you weren't arrested, because there must be something slightly unusual about watching people dismantle part of a World War II aircraft in freezing -30 temperatures in Canada. Did no one approach you and just say, hang on a minute, what are you doing?
No, not really. Do you know what? Actually, it kind of went the other way. We're featured on a sort of a Warbird program online on YouTube with several thousand subscribers, and a little post went out on that program as to what we were doing in Peterborough and Canada in general. And the next day, we had 6 or 7 local volunteers down on the airfield helping us remove the parts from the aircraft. So it's amazing how the aviation community sort of comes together for these projects, really.
So how are you getting these things back? Because I take it that you haven't walked them through customs.
No, you're right. They're a little bit big to come through customs, although I'm sure the team back in Coventry would have been more than happy if I had managed to do that. But we loaded all of the parts very, very carefully into a 40-foot sea freight container, which has already left for the UK. So we're expecting the parts back in Coventry probably in the last week of February. So the guys back at base will be tremendously excited about that, and that'll give the project a real boost.
It still feels as though there's a lot of work to do. I mean, it's slightly stressing me out, Charlie, so I don't know how you must be feeling to get this thing in the air by June.
You're right. There is a lot of work to do. There's no doubt about that. There's tremendous amounts that are going on in the background to make this happen, and I'd be lying if I didn't say, I wasn't having that sort of a few sleepless nights. But I think we're on track with a project of this side. It's very, very hard to tell exactly where you are until you're probably a few weeks, if not days, out from the deadline. But I'm confident we'll be there.
I look forward to catching up with you. In the meantime, Charlie, it's an amazing story. That's Charlie Walker, pilot and organiser of the Night Fright Restoration Project. Will she fly by June? Keep listening and we'll tell you. Here's Kim Wilde now, and You Came on BBC Radio Berkshire. Travel You Trust on the way after this, and the latest BBC News at midday with Chris as well.